All right, so now that we know about the parent material where soil comes from, let's look at the other parts that are making up the whole entire composition of the soil. Those minerals and rocks part make up 45%, the organic matter 5%, and very important, water 25% and air 25%. You wouldn't think those would be so important, but we'll get to why those are vital to soil composition. And the soil is typically in layers, and we'll talk about those types of layers that it would be in. So again, let's look back at the minerals. Again, the minerals are going to be from weathered rock, and they actually provide all the essential nutrients for the plant material and a solid base for the roots of the plants and things like that that would be in the soil. And the mineral composition would vary, you could imagine, depending on the type of parent material you would have. If you've got one type of rock, that's going to give some different mineral composition than a different type of rock. And typically older soils have fewer nutrients just because those nutrients have either been leached out or been absorbed by plants, so forth. So these older soils are usually in the mostly southern hemisphere because those are older continents, Australia, South America. But the northern hemisphere, from what we would consider somewhat recent glacier activity, have actually a pretty rich soil. The organic matter, very important to soil, even though it only makes up 5% of the soil. We call it the basically dead material is called litter. It's not like paper and garbage litter, but just dead leaves and branches. We have animal waste and dead plants and other materials that would be considered, all that is considered litter. And all of these things are in various stages of decay. You might have if you go walk through the woods at this time of year, you'll see that there are some leaves maybe that were from last fall whenever they fell off the trees, and then you've got some current leaves that are just falling off the trees now. And this is really important because those dead particles are releasing their essential nutrients back into the soil. And that dark organic matter is known as humus, and the humus and the organic matter really are vital to retaining moisture and lots of nutrients. And when we say humus, make sure you know which type we are talking about. We're talking about the dark brown humus for soil, not the delicious hummus with veggies and some pita chips there. As I mentioned, the other very, very vital part of the soil composition are the 50% that make up the water and air in the soil. And you think, why would those be so important? Well, when we talk about the soil are actually solid particles, and they can only be packed so close together. So there's pore spaces around all these soil particles, and I've got a graphic coming up after this explanation. And these are needed for the transport of water to the plant roots and also for the transport of nutrients. The water are going to go in the smaller pores, and if the water is not absorbed, then it can actually go through to a lower depth in the soil. And oftentimes when it does that, it kind of grabs some of the nutrients that are in those soil particles, and what's called leaching. It leaches those soils to a lower depth as well. And then the airs are in the larger pores, and usually in the soil we've got more CO2 and less oxygen than we would have in the atmospheric air. So here's the picture of the soil. Here's the soil particles in the brown, and we see that the smaller spaces between the soil particles, so this soil particle to this one, that smaller space is filled up with water, and the bigger gaps are filled up with air. The soil formation, how does it actually occur? Well, again, we start with that parent material. The soil does take a lot longer to form when you're in colder climates, and that's just because it takes things longer to decay, less plant growth, so you're going to get less material to actually decay. Topography has an important part in that. If you have steep slopes, they usually have a high rate of erosion, and so you don't get much soil formed on those steeper slopes. Also very important is what type of organisms are in the soil. So they actually help to distribute the organic matter and mix things up, and actually create air pockets, so that again that air is vital to that. So soil with lots of worms and actually things we don't, as homeowners, we don't necessarily like, voles and moles, things like that, that they actually mix the soil together. And very important, you need time. Soil does not happen overnight. Soil takes actually hundreds of years to reform once it's been stripped of an area. So the basic process for the soil formation is breakdown of rocks through either biological, chemical, physical weathering, and that chemical weathering would be like some sort of acid reaction. Physical weathering is often freeze-thaw cycles, which breaks the rocks into smaller particles. And organisms put the CO2 in the soil, that makes carbonic acid, and that creates those. And again, another part is the freeze-thaw cycles. The organic matter accumulates, and over time that soil forms. Again, it's going to be hundreds of years for that to occur. The thickness of the soil will vary quite a bit, even within one general region. So if we talk about like even Pennsylvania, you're going to have less soil on the tops of mountain ridges and steep slopes, just because of erosion is going to drive it down into the valleys. So as a result, then valleys do have more soil, moderate slopes, and old growth forests would also have a much more considerable amount of soil. Here's those soil organisms. What could they be? They could be different fungi. You can see worms, you can see moles, insects, plant roots, any type of burrowing animals, microbes. All those things are good things that are actually helpful to making the soil form and help break down that organic matter and also the rock material. Next, we want to look at the layering of the soil and what compromises the depth of the soil. We basically separate it into several different regions. You've got the O layer, the A horizon, the B horizon, the C, and then the parent bedrock material. And kind of in here between the A and the B, we're also going to throw another type. And we're going to talk about each one of these individually, but you should be very familiar with this picture. It's pretty easy to remember since it's A, B, C, but remember where the organic matter here, and we're going to throw this letter E in here as well. But just knowing what the hard part is remembering what's in which layer. So in the O horizon, that's the very surface of the soil. O stands for organic. Right? We said we call that stuff leaf litter or litter, but another word for it is detritus. Oftentimes many words for a very similar type thing. This is most obvious in a forest floor or grasslands where you see lots of decaying matter. You probably don't notice this as much in your own lawn, things like that, but you see it more in a forest area. The next layer is the A horizon. This is actually the top soil part. This has where most of the organic matter and those minerals are mixed together. This is where you got your soil sample, most likely. You didn't dig a deep hole. The A horizon, it can vary in depth. Again, it could be from just a few inches thick to actually several feet thick in some low-lying areas, maybe along river banks, etc., in valleys. The next part is actually called the E horizon. So underneath the A is E. It's only present in some soils. This is where we said how that water, if it's not absorbed, can actually leach some of those nutrients out of that layer. So this is going to be kind of like the zone of leaching. Another word for that is alluviation. And here you're going to have iron deposits, aluminum, some organic acids. So this is usually going to make the soil pretty acidic in that E horizon because of the iron and aluminum and the organic acids that would be there. The next layer would be the B horizon. This is known as the subsoil. This is mostly mineral material, so we're going to change that composition from 25% mineral to much higher with very little organic matter. But it does have the basic nutrients in it. And then below that we have the C horizon, and this is going to be very similar to the parent material. It's the least weathered and very little organic matter present in the C horizon. Okay. Let's move on next to talk about some physical properties of soil, and a lot of these you'll see in the soil lab. First is texture, and this is determined by percentages of sand, silt, and clay, which is various sizes of particles. Next is porosity, and this depends on the soil texture. You can see how these two are very closely related. The more porous material you have, the different textures are going to be related to that. Sand is the most porous because it has the biggest particles, and clay is the least porous because it has the smallest particles. You really need a good mixture to have what is considered good quality soil, and kind of like the ideal is a mixture of the three that's known as loam. And loam contains 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. As I mentioned, sand is the largest particles. They feel gritty to the touch. Silt is a medium, and it kind of feels smooth or almost like a flour texture, like if you were putting some flour in between your fingers and what that would feel like. And clay is the very finest, and you've probably held some clay in your hands before, and has that sticky feel to it, almost really, really small particle size. This soil pyramid is a chart you should be familiar with. You can see that if we did have that 40% sand, we would read up this direction, and all this line the whole way up would be 40% sand. If we had 40% silt, it would be down in this direction, like this. And if we had 20% clay, and that would meet right here where we've got what's considered medium loam, and that would be our ideal soil. Some of the chemical properties of soil. So we talked about their physical characteristics as far as texture and porosity, but there's also some very vital chemical properties as well. Clay particles, so if you have a large amount of clay, clay particles are overall negatively charged, and that is because of their structure and their chemical makeup. So if they're negatively charged, that means they're going to attract positive ions, which are called cations. That then leads to what's known as a soil property known as the cation exchange capacity, or CEC. And this is the ability to absorb and release cations. You actually do want a high CEC for agriculture, but at the same point you don't want too high of a number, because that clay holds too much water and doesn't have a lot of oxygen, doesn't have a lot of pore spaces in it, so that's detrimental. So you do have to find that balance. A lot of times people think, who would want clay in your soil because it's just so hard and dense, but you do need that because of this cation exchange capacity. Soil bases, on the other hand, let me go back a second here. If you have clay and it attracts these positive ions are often going to be things that are going to be on the acidic nature. As opposed to that, we have soil bases, which would be calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium ions. So the calcium with a +2, magnesium with a +2, potassium +1, sodium with a +1. These are going to neutralize the soil acids that contain aluminum and hydrogen. So typically you don't really want a lot of acids when you're trying to have plant growth, just because that's causes a lower pH, and not favorable for plant growth. And base saturation is the actual name of the property. It's the proportion of soil bases to soil acids, and usually given as a percentage. So we've got the CEC, which is going to measure the negative ions essentially, and base saturation, which measures the positive ions. And then third component, we talked about the physical and the chemical, and then last, the biological components of soil, the fungi, bacteria, protozoa, rodents, earthworms. We call those together, often they're called detritivores, and we'll talk about those when we talk about more ecology in our next unit. But these are all also vital components to the soil.